Clearly there's something very wrong in the Metropolitan Police's vetting regime, that a man with, a history, I think he'd been accused of sort of flashing 3 times, indecent exposure 3 times, and who was referred to allegedly by some of his colleagues as the rapist. This was in a report this morning in one of the newspapers, I believe it was the Telegraph. How on earth was he allowed to pass his vetting, not just to become a police officer, but to actually be patrolling embassies and patrolling Parliament around some of the most, important people, arguably, in our nation? I mean, Nigel, is this a massive failure of the Met? Because it certainly seems like it.
Yeah, I mean, there are 2 debates here that shouldn't necessarily be put into one. This is a colossal failure of vetting, all right? This is a guy who worked with the nuclear police, armed police, ready to deal with terrorism. This is a man who was in the Palace of Westminster with access to all areas. This was, somebody with a gun operating at the highest level within the police force. And it is a disastrous failure of vetting, and it's something that absolutely must not be swept under the carpet, all right? Then we move on to the bigger and broader debate about the police, how they operate, and whether we trust them. Now, I'm quite sure that there are some bad apples within the police force, as there are in all walks of life, all right? But if we get ourselves into this mess, as we did a few years ago, the police are institutionally racist. If we now start to say that the police are institutionally misogynist, what we do is we further damage public trust in the police force, who've got a damned hard enough job to do anyway. The vast majority of them are I've certainly met loads over the years, very decent men and women, trying very, very hard. But the government is somewhat knee-jerking to this. I mean, Kit Malthouse, he says the other day that it's perfectly reasonable for anyone who's approached by a lone police officer to call 999 or wave down passing motorists. I mean, what, call 999 and get another lone police officer to turn up? I mean, statements like that by Malthouse and by Boris Johnson, Boris criticises the police. Hey, hang on, the Conservatives have been in power since 2010, and I just worry that what Kit Malthouse has said means that nobody can be arrested ever again by a lone police officer. I just think we've got to get a sense of proportion, a sense of balance on this, and we must not further damage the police's ability to do the job. The institutional racism led to people being stopped and searched for knives, led to that going down, and that wasn't the sole reason for a rise in knife crime, but it certainly contributed. And if we're stopping police officers out there from getting on with their job without the traffic being stopped or 999 being called, I'm not sure we're in a very good place.
Absolutely, and Paul, people have said this is for the Metropolitan to fix, police to fix, it's not for women to fix. I mean, I think that is the key, and we've heard that there's been fundamental failings in relation to spotting this gentleman. He's not a gentleman at all, why did I use that phrase? Spotting this man in the police service and what he thought and what he eventually did. So it's really for the Met to step up in relation to this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is, and I tend to agree with the second part of what Nigel said. I mean, look, the murder of Sarah Everard was wicked. It was brutal. The reports that were coming out of the Old Bailey were really, really difficult to listen to. But it was ultimately a very, very unprecedented and isolated incident. I mean, for a police officer to use his powers to abduct a woman from the street and then take her away and murder her in those brutal circumstances is highly, highly unusual. And my concern is that if we give the impression that actually this is much more common than it truly is, we are going to create a schism between the public and the police, and particularly between women and the police. Now, there will be circumstances where some women are perhaps in danger at night and would be looking for a police officer to be there, whether it's a lone male police officer or anybody else. In normal circumstances, you would want women to feel comfortable about approaching that police officer. But if we give the impression that actually every lone male police officer is potentially a predator, then we're going to potentially encourage those women not to approach those officers. And I don't think that's in the interests of women ultimately. So, yeah, absolutely, there needs to be very hard and searching questions asked about how this individual was allowed to get into the police force in the first place. There were allegations against him just a few days before the abduction of Sarah Everard, which appear not to have been looked into. But it's crucial, I think, at times like this, that we don't have a knee-jerk reaction and that we apply some proportion to the wider debate.
I couldn't agree more with you on that, Paul. But to discuss this further, joining us now is Peter Bexley, former Scotland Yard detective and now turned author. Peter, thank you for joining us. But can we just first get your reflections on what we've seen in the reports from the Old Bailey in what happened in the really tragic case of Sarah Everard, and how it was missed some of Wayne Couzens' behaviours for him to be allowed into such a sort of senior policing position?
Wayne Couzens is clearly a monster, and his abominable acts are tragic, and bless Sarah's soul. I appreciate Nigel and Paul's even-handedness in this discussion. However, there is something which is rather unpalatable, but is unavoidable, and that is that alongside the heroic and wonderful stuff that so many of our police officers do, there is a crisis here. There is a deep, deep problem in terms of culture, how police officers can report concerns. Are there the structures, sophisticated structures, whereby people can confidentially and confidently report something that may not be a criminal offence, that may not be a breach of the police discipline code, but is a concern nonetheless? Something, for example, like Wayne Couzens overtly wearing his handcuffs when he's off duty and walking the dog. Those kind of things need to be reported and dealt with appropriately. There are many, many other matters of huge concern about that monster, and there are ongoing inquiries, and the results of those will be known. But there is a deep problem within policing, and it simply has to be addressed.
Thanks, Peter. So what would you like to see in terms of structures to try and help officers to report such kind of incidents if they see them in their colleagues?
Every police force, the length and breadth of the country, has a system whereby wrongdoing, criminality can be reported. But historically, the investigation of crimes allegedly committed by police officers is done by the police or the Independent Office of Police Conduct. And they've really become a bit of a blunt instrument over the years. And what I mean by that is that they search for evidence of crime, they search for evidence of a breach of the discipline code, and in that regards, that's the blunt instrument. There's not subtlety about it, in so much as that something that doesn't necessarily be a crime or a breach of the code can't kind of be dealt with. I think in so many regards, the police have become a bit afraid of their own shadow, in so much as that supervision isn't what it should be. There's not that, because officers are afraid of being reported, having their careers blighted if they're seen to be overly zealous about these kind of matters. And so, in essence, I think the entire policing culture needs to be looked at, particularly with regards to certain police officers who exercise their biceps more than their brains and develop a kind of macho and possibly rather misogynist kind of take on things.
Peter, you've made the argument that the police force needs to reform itself, and I fully understand what you've said. But just quickly, you know, when Kit Malthouse says to people, oh, well, if a single police officer, you know, stops you in the street, arrests you, you're quite entitled to wave down passing cars or to ring 999. I mean, this is damning the entirety of the police force with the abominable actions of one man, I would suggest. I mean, isn't this a way? Isn't the government aware of how horrified people were by what was said, what we heard from the Old Bailey. Isn't the government damaging public trust in policing?
Oh, without a doubt. And some of Malthouse's advice is right up there in their stupidity stakes with the Met Police's own advice to flag down a bus. So suddenly now our bus drivers of the nation are going to be the arbiters of who and who isn't purporting to be a police officer. Utterly ludicrous. Most people, in my opinion, want to trust our police, want to have confidence in our police, and in order for that to be regained and reach previous levels, we need a thorough either royal commission or public inquiry across policing as a genre.
Peter, it's Paul Embry here. I was interested in what you said about the structures of the police. I mean, one of the criticisms that's aimed at the police these days, and I have to say I have some sympathy with it, is that effectively the police are now really just a group of politicised social workers, and actually certainly in many minds of members of the public, the whole thing about detection and prevention of crime seems to have taken a back seat. Do you share that view, and is that a concern that's expressed by your fellow officers within the job itself?
Yes, unfortunately, policing in recent years has become a one-stop shop for all of society's ills, from things as petty as people receiving the wrong topping on their pizza, and I wish I was joking, to very, very serious matters like people in mental health crises. So much policing time is taken up with that, where of course it should be dealt with by a 24-hour mental health crisis system, teams that quite frankly aren't there because so many mental health workers down tools at 5 p.m. and thereafter can't be raised. Back in my day, it was very much a game of not a game, but a job that was cops and robbers, good guys and bad guys. And now all of society's ills fall at the feet of our beleaguered and underfunded police service, who still do brilliant, brilliant things every day, which is why I say we need wholesale review in order that major reform can be driven and the public can regain this confidence.